Tonight, we uncover a truth hidden, not in spells or shadows, but in archives, condemnations, and centuries of quiet observation. A story not about secret magic, but about symbols carved in stone, oaths spoken in whispers, and a brotherhood that grew in plain sight while Rome took notes. The Vatican did not guess where Freemason rituals came from. It watched them form. From cathedral scaffolds to candlelit lodges, from simple tools to layered ceremonies, every step left a trail of ink, fear, and authority. What began as a world of builders became a world of ideas. And when those ideas crossed borders, mixed beliefs, and shaped conscience without permission, the alarms rang. Papal bulls were written, reports were filed, names were recorded, not to erase Masonry, but to understand it well enough to oppose it forever. So before we open the vaults of history and trace what the Vatican truly knows, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because this story is not about legends. It is about memory, power, and who gets to define the meaning of symbols. Picture the square and compasses stamped on a lodge seal, the 2 pillars drawn on tracing boards, and the apron worn like a badge. These are not just pictures. In the eyes of Catholic leaders, they became signs of a private world inside Europe. And here is the part most people miss. Rome does not guess when it pays attention. Rome writes, receives, files, and remembers. So when someone claims the Vatican knows the real origins of Freemason rituals and symbols, the sober question is simple. What do the Vatican's own condemnations and letters actually say, and what do they allow us to prove? Historians can trace modern Freemasonry to the early 18th century, with evidence in Britain. In the year 1717, several London lodges formed a body that later became famous as the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster. As lodges spread into France, the Dutch Republic, the Italian states, and the German lands, the same pattern followed: private meetings, recognition signs, and sworn obligations. In a Europe still shaped by religious conflict, secrecy alone could trigger alarm. Those concerns reached the Vatican in a direct way in the year 1738. Pope Clement XII issued the bull In Eminenti Apostolatus Specula, condemning Masonic associations and warning Catholics not to join. The reasons given were not supernatural. They were practical and political: secrecy, binding oaths, and the suspicion that hidden groups could threaten both faith and public order. In the year 1751, Pope Benedict XIV reinforced the ban in the bull Providas Romanorum Pontificum, making clear the warning was meant to last. This is the paper trail. Bishops wrote to Rome asking what to do with lodge members in their dioceses. Papal offices answered with rules for confession, penalties, and public warnings. Nuncios and local clergy reported what they heard from courts, police, and informants. In some places, states seized lodge papers during investigations, and summaries of what was found could move through church channels. Even when reports were biased, they still captured details, lodge names, meeting places, and the kinds of oaths they swore. So, what does this reveal about origins? It shows that many core symbols were easy to trace to building culture. Tools like the square, level, and compass used as lessons about honesty, balance, and self-control. It shows why Solomon's temple appeared so often, because the Bible already made it a powerful image of sacred building and wisdom, long before Freemasonry used it as a ritual story. It also shows how rituals evolved fast. In the year 1730, a London exposure called Masonry, dissected by Samuel Pritchard, described parts of the ritual, and it gave critics something concrete to compare with rumour. So, the hook for this series is not a claim of hidden sorcery, it is a colder idea. If you want to know where the rituals and symbols really came from, you follow who was watching, who was writing, and who kept the files. Long before anyone spoke of Freemasons as a brotherhood of symbols and philosophy, there existed a very real world of craftsmen whose daily lives shaped everything that came later. In medieval Europe, from roughly the 11th century onward, large stone buildings began to rise across the landscape. Cathedrals, abbeys, castles, and city walls demanded skills that could not be learned overnight. Stonemasons became a specialized class of workers, trained through long apprenticeships, trusted with complex plans, and responsible for structures meant to last for centuries. Their work sites were not casual gathering places. They were organized environments where knowledge had to be protected. Mistakes could cost lives, and skill determined status. This is where the word lodge first matters. A lodge was not a secret temple. It was a wooden shelter built beside a construction site where masons stored tools, ate meals, planned work, and trained younger members. It was practical, not mystical, and it existed wherever large stone projects existed. Guild culture grew naturally from these conditions. By the 12th and 13th centuries, many European cities recognized craft guilds that regulated training, wages, and standards. Masons were often treated differently from other trades because their work required travel. A cathedral could take decades or even centuries to complete, and skilled workers moved from site to site. To prove their training, Masons relied on shared signs, words, and methods that showed competence without written certificates, since most people could not read. These were not invented to hide dark secrets. They were tools of survival in a world without modern records. If you could not prove your skill, you did not work. The church played a central role in this system. Most major stone projects were commissioned by bishops, monasteries, or religious orders. Masons worked under church patronage and within a Christian worldview. Biblical stories, moral lessons, and religious discipline were part of daily life. It was normal for work to be opened with prayer, and for craftsmanship to be linked with ideas of order, harmony, and divine design. Geometry mattered not only because it made buildings stand, but because it reflected a belief that creation followed measurable rules. This connection between work, morality, and faith was not separate from medieval life. It was the structure of it. Records from this period are limited but telling. City laws, payment rolls, and later guild charters show that Masons were organized, disciplined, and respected. There is no evidence of secret global brotherhoods or hidden ancient religions at this stage. What does exist is a culture of shared identity built around tools, skill, and trust. Over time, these practical systems created habits. Meeting in lodges, teaching through symbols, and valuing discretion became normal. When later centuries transformed these working groups into philosophical societies, they did not invent a foundation from nothing. They inherited it from the medieval craft world, where stone, labor, and belief were already tightly bound together. By the High Middle Ages, stone building had become one of the most visible expressions of Christian power in Europe. From the late 11th century through the 14th century, cathedrals rose in cities like Chartres, Notre Dame in Paris, Canterbury, Cologne, and Milan. These were not only places of worship, they were statements of faith, authority, and cosmic order carved into stone. Behind every soaring vault and towering spire stood teams of craftsmen whose lives were deeply tied to the church. Bishops and abbots controlled funding, approved designs, and decided which projects would continue or halt. For Masons, this meant steady work, but also constant exposure to religious teaching. Their labor unfolded inside a Christian worldview that shaped how they understood both their tools and themselves. Geometry was at the center of this relationship. Medieval builders did not see geometry as abstract math. It was practical knowledge tied to belief. Circles, squares, and proportions were used to ensure stability, but they were also seen as reflections of divine order. Church thinkers taught that God created the world with measure and harmony, and builders were expected to mirror that order on earth. A Mason learning how to draw a perfect square or align a column was also absorbing a lesson about balance, truth, and discipline. This is why tools carried meaning. The square ensured right angles, but also suggested moral uprightness. The compass set limits and proportions, and could be linked to self-control. These meanings were not hidden codes. They were taught openly in sermons, manuals, and daily instruction. Cathedral sites functioned as schools as much as workplaces. Young apprentices lived and worked alongside masters for years, sometimes decades. Instruction happened through demonstration rather than books, since literacy was rare. Lessons were physical and visual. You learned by watching, repeating, and correcting mistakes. Moral behavior mattered. A careless worker endangered lives. A dishonest one could ruin a structure. Church overseers reinforced this connection between character and craftsmanship. Obedience, patience, and humility were praised as virtues, both spiritual and professional. In this environment, moral teaching and technical training naturally blended together. The church also regulated time and ritual on building sites. Work followed the liturgical calendar. Feast days paused construction. Mass opened major phases of work. Oaths were sworn on Christian symbols. This matters because later critics of Freemasonry often claimed its rituals were foreign to Christianity. In reality, ritualized behavior was already part of medieval life. Oaths, prayers, and symbolic acts were normal tools for organizing trust in a world without contracts or courts for everyday labor disputes. Over generations, these habits became traditions. The lodge became more than a shelter. It was a space of instruction, discipline, and identity. The overlap between tools, geometry, and moral teaching was not invented later by philosophers. It was forged stone by stone under church patronage. When later Freemasons looked back to builders as symbolic ancestors, they were drawing on a real historical relationship. The cathedrals of Christendom were not just monuments of faith. They were classrooms where practical skill, belief, and symbolism learned to speak the same language. By the late medieval period, the working culture of Masons had begun to leave behind written traces that still survive today. These documents are known collectively as the Old Charges, and they are among the most important sources for understanding how operative lodges actually saw themselves. The most famous examples are the Regius manuscript, dated to the late 14th century, and the Cook manuscript, written in the early 15th century. These texts were not secret books hidden from the world. They were practical guides meant to be read aloud within lodges, setting rules for behavior, training, and loyalty, while also explaining where the craft believed it came from. What immediately stands out in these manuscripts is the way craftsmanship is linked to morality and religion. The Regius manuscript opens with a poetic history of geometry, describing it as a noble science given by God. It connects Masonry to biblical figures and ancient wisdom, not to claim magical origins, but to place the trade inside a sacred timeline familiar to medieval Christians. Adam is described as learning geometry, Noah is mentioned after the flood, and Solomon's temple appears as a model of sacred building. This blending of Bible stories with trade history reflects how medieval people understood legitimacy. A craft was honorable if it could be tied to divine order and moral law. The rules that follow are clear and practical. Masons are told to be true to God and Holy Church, to obey their masters, to avoid theft, and to live honestly among their neighbors. These are not mysterious instructions. They are social rules meant to protect reputation and trust. A Mason who broke these rules did not just harm himself. He endangered the standing of the entire lodge. In a world where word of mouth mattered more than written contracts, moral conduct was as important as skill with stone. The Cook manuscript repeats many of these themes, but adds detail. It traces geometry through figures like Euclid and places Masonry within a long chain of teaching and transmission. Again, the tone is Christian and orderly. There is no sign of rebellion against the Church. In fact, Loyalty to God and respect for religious authority are emphasized throughout. This matters because later accusations against Freemasonry often claim it grew from anti-Christian roots. The earliest evidence shows the opposite. Operative Masonry defined itself as part of a Christian moral world. These old charges also show how lodges maintained continuity. Rules were meant to be memorized and passed on orally. Reading them aloud reinforced shared values and identity. They created a sense of belonging that went beyond any single building site. Over time, this habit of formal instruction, moral language, and symbolic history became part of lodge culture itself. When later Freemasonry developed rituals and lectures, it did not invent the idea of linking work, ethics, and sacred history. That pattern already existed in the operative lodges of medieval Europe. The old charges prove that long before philosophy entered the lodge, craftsmen were already using biblical stories and moral rules to explain who they were and why their work mattered. Few symbols appear as often in Masonic language as the Temple of Solomon, and this repetition has fueled centuries of speculation. Yet, its presence does not begin with Freemasonry at all. In medieval and early modern Christianity, the Temple of Solomon was already one of the most powerful symbols available. It represented divine order, sacred space, and the idea that God could dwell among men through a structure built according to perfect measure. For Christian Europe, the temple was not a Jewish relic of the past, but a theological model that explained how heaven and earth could align through obedience, skill, and faith. Church thinkers read the biblical account of the temple as more than history. It was treated as allegory. Solomon was seen as a wise king chosen by God. The temple itself symbolized the ideal relationship between God, ruler, and people. Medieval sermons, commentaries, and art returned to this image again and again. The temple stood for order rising from chaos, light replacing darkness, and sacred law shaping the physical world. This is why its measurements mattered. The Bible describes dimensions, materials, and layout in detail, and Christian scholars believed these details carried moral meaning. For builders working under church authority, this symbolism was impossible to avoid. Cathedrals were often described as reflections of the heavenly Jerusalem or echoes of Solomon's temple. The idea was not that a cathedral copied the temple exactly, but that it followed the same principle. Sacred buildings were meant to be constructed with care, proportion, and purity of intent. Geometry became a bridge between scripture and stone. When Masons studied proportion, they were participating in a tradition that linked their labor to biblical wisdom. By the late Middle Ages, the Temple of Solomon had become a shared mental reference across Europe. Painters depicted it, preachers referenced it, architects used it as a symbolic ancestor. This widespread familiarity explains why operative Masons included Solomon in their legendary histories, as seen in the old charges. Mentioning the temple did not suggest secret allegiance to ancient Israel. It simply placed the craft within a respected Christian story that emphasized divine order and moral responsibility. When Freemasonry later emerged as a speculative society in the 17th and 18th centuries, it inherited this symbolic language. The temple offered a ready-made framework for teaching ideas about self-improvement, harmony, and ethical conduct. It was already understood by educated Christians as a metaphor, not a literal blueprint. Using it allowed lodges to speak in a moral language that felt ancient, serious, and familiar. This continuity is important for understanding why Vatican critics paid close attention to temple symbolism. Church authorities knew the biblical roots of these images. They also knew how powerful allegory could be when removed from official teaching. The concern was not that the temple symbol was foreign, but that it was being used outside church control. Solomon's temple appears everywhere in Masonic tradition because it already appeared everywhere in Christian thought. Freemasonry did not import it from a hidden past. It inherited it from the symbolic world that medieval Christendom had already built. As medieval crafts grew more specialized, skilled workers faced a basic problem. They needed ways to prove who they were and what they knew in a world with no licenses, no photos, and very little writing. This is where trade secrets and modes of recognition developed. In stonemasonry, these were practical solutions. A master needed to know if a traveling mason was trained before trusting him with dangerous work. Simple gestures, words, or demonstrations of technique could confirm skill without exposing it to outsiders. These methods were not mystical. They were safeguards built into the working world. Over time, these practical systems gained meaning beyond their original purpose. When a mason learned a sign or word, he was not only gaining access to work, he was being accepted into a community with shared rules and values. Trust mattered. So did discretion. Speaking openly about a project or revealing techniques to the untrained could ruin livelihoods or cause accidents. Silence became a virtue. Loyalty became a requirement. These habits slowly shaped a culture where knowledge was passed carefully and with intention. As generations passed, the tools themselves began to speak symbolically. The square reminded a worker to check his angles, but it also reminded him to act honestly. The level ensured balance in stone, but it also suggested fairness among men. This kind of thinking was normal in medieval life. Objects often carried moral lessons. Church sermons used everyday items as teaching aids. Craft culture followed the same pattern. There was no single moment when tools became symbols. It happened naturally as work and belief overlapped. When lodges began admitting non-working members in later centuries, these symbolic habits proved useful. Gentlemen who did not cut stone could still understand lessons taught through familiar objects. A tool became a metaphor. A gesture became a reminder of obligation. What once confirmed skill now reinforced ethics. This shift did not require a hidden master plan. It followed a simple path. Practical customs survived because they worked. Then they adapted because the audience changed. Critics later saw secrecy and assumed conspiracy. But secrecy in trades was common. Tailors, metalworkers, and carpenters all guarded methods. What made Masonry stand out was its close connection to large church projects and its long training process. These factors preserve traditions more carefully than in many other trades. When the Vatican later examined Masonic practices, it encountered rituals that looked secretive, but were rooted in normal craft behavior. Understanding this evolution removes the need for extreme explanations. Symbols did not appear suddenly as coded messages from a hidden past. They grew from daily work, repeated habits, and moral teaching shaped by Christian culture. The transition from trade secret to moral symbol was gradual and practical. It explains how Freemasonry could develop a rich symbolic language without borrowing from forbidden sources. What remained controversial was not the origin of the symbols, but who controlled their meaning once they left the world of stone and entered the world of ideas. By the late 16th century, Scotland provides the clearest window into how working lodges began to change in visible and documented ways. Unlike earlier periods where evidence is scattered and indirect, Scottish records place Masonry firmly on paper. Lodge minutes, membership rolls, and official regulations survive, showing organizations that were no longer only temporary work shelters tied to a single building site. They were becoming stable bodies, with rules, officers, and a sense of continuity that extended beyond any one project. The key figure in this transition is William Shaw, appointed Master of Works to King James VI of Scotland. In the year 1598, and again in 1599, Shaw issued a set of regulations, now known as the Shaw Statutes. These documents did not invent Masonry, but they organized it. They required lodges to keep written records, enforce discipline, and oversee the training of apprentices and fellows. They also linked local lodges together under shared standards. This marks a turning point. Masonry was no longer just a collection of craftsmen working where stone was needed. It was becoming an institution. The language of the Shaw Statutes is important. They emphasize order, obedience, and moral conduct. Masters were responsible not only for skill, but for behavior. Apprentices were bound to years of service and examination before advancement. Attendance at lodge meetings was required. Penalties were imposed for disorder. These rules resemble guild regulations across Europe, but in Scotland they are unusually well preserved. This allows historians to watch structure forming in real time. Lodge minutes from places like Edinburgh and Kilwinning deepen the picture. They record admissions, fines, disputes, and decisions. They show lodges meeting even when no major construction was underway. This suggests the lodge itself had become a social and regulatory body, not just a workplace. Some members were still active builders. Others held titles or land. The boundary between operative mason and respected local gentleman was beginning to blur. This is also where early signs of accepted members appear. In the early 17th century, men who were not working stonemasons were admitted into lodges. They did not cut stone, but they participated in meetings and obligations. This change did not happen overnight, and it did not happen everywhere at once. But Scotland provides the earliest clear evidence of the shift. Lodges were becoming spaces for shared values, identity, and mutual trust, not just labor. For later Vatican observers, this period mattered deeply. Organization creates visibility. Written rules create accountability. When Freemasonry later spread across Europe, critics could trace its lineage back to these structured lodges. What began as craft regulation now looked like a parallel society. The Scottish turning point shows that this evolution was gradual and documented. It was not hidden in myth. It was written down, signed, and enforced in a world still shaped by monarchy, church, authority, and law. By the early 17th century, something new began to appear inside certain lodges. Men who were not builders. These were landowners, scholars, military officers, and local officials who had no practical role in cutting stone or raising walls. They became known as accepted masons, not because they were skilled in the craft, but because they were admitted into the lodge by choice. This development marks one of the most important turning points in the history of Freemasonry, because it changed what the lodge was for. Historical records from Scotland and England show this shift clearly. In the year 1641, the English antiquarian Elias Ashmole recorded his initiation into a lodge in Warrington. Ashmole was not a mason by trade. He was a scholar with interests in history, astronomy, and symbolism. His diary entry is important because it proves that by the mid-17th century, lodges were already admitting men whose value lay in ideas rather than labor. This was not an isolated case. Similar admissions appear in lodge minutes across Britain. Why would working masons allow outsiders into their private world? The answer is social change. Large cathedral projects were slowing. Stone building continued, but not at the same scale as the High Middle Ages. Lodges that once existed only to support. Construction now had more time to function as social bodies. At the same time, educated men were searching for places to gather safely. Europe was fractured by religious tension and political conflict. Open debate could be dangerous. A lodge offered privacy, structure, and shared rules. The presence of accepted masons changed how traditions were used. Tools that once taught skill could now teach ethics. Stories that once explained the dignity of labor could now explain personal improvement. The lodge became a place where ideas about morality, order, and knowledge could be discussed without directly challenging church or state. This did not mean lodges became rebellious. Many accepted masons were loyal Christians and subjects of their rulers. But the lodge gave them a shared, symbolic language that crossed class lines. This transition also explains why rituals became more formal. When members no longer shared the same trade, instruction needed to be symbolic rather than technical. Initiation became a way to teach values instead of skills. Oaths emphasized loyalty and discretion. Meetings followed set patterns. None of this required ancient secrets. It required only adaptation to a new audience. From the Vatican perspective, this change mattered greatly. A group of craftsmen posed little ideological risk. A mixed society of educated men meeting in private did. Even if discussions were moral rather than political, the structure itself raised concern. Lodges now created bonds outside parish, family, and guild. Authority was shared internally rather than imposed from above. The accepted Mason represents the moment when Masonry crossed a line. It moved from stone to thought, from work to worldview. This did not erase its origins. It transformed them. And once that transformation was complete, Freemasonry could spread far beyond building sites, carrying symbols shaped by labor into a world increasingly shaped by ideas. By the late 17th century, Europe had become a pressure cooker of ideas. Old authorities still ruled, but new ways of thinking were spreading fast. Scientific discoveries challenged long-held beliefs. Printing presses multiplied books and pamphlets. Religious wars had exhausted entire regions, leaving people wary of open conflict yet hungry for understanding. In this environment, speculative Masonry did not arise in isolation. It formed inside a society searching for controlled spaces where ideas could be explored without inviting punishment. Scientific societies offer an important comparison. Groups like the Royal Society in England, founded in the year 1660, gathered men interested in observation, experiment, and reason. These meetings were not secret, but they were selective. Membership required trust. Discussions stayed within the group. This model showed that structured associations could exist alongside church and state without directly challenging them. Lodges followed a similar logic, but with added privacy. Ritual and symbolism created bonds stronger than casual membership, helping ensure discretion. Print culture intensified this need. Books and essays could now travel faster than ever before. Ideas once confined to scholars spread into cities and towns. With this spread came risk. Authorities monitored printers. Writers faced censorship. A spoken idea in a trusted room felt safer than a printed page that could be seized. Lodges offered exactly that kind of space. Members could discuss morality, philosophy, and natural law without putting words into permanent form. Religious conflict also played a major role. Catholics, Protestants, and various reform movements lived side by side, often in tension. Public debate could quickly turn dangerous. Lodges avoided direct theological arguments by focusing on shared ethical principles. God was acknowledged, but doctrine was not debated. This approach allowed men of different Christian backgrounds to meet without conflict. From a practical standpoint, it reduced risk. From a Vatican standpoint, it raised suspicion. Any group that softened doctrinal boundaries appeared threatening, even if it claimed moral intentions. Speculative Masonry thrived in this narrow space between freedom and restraint. It used inherited symbols from the craft world because they were neutral. A square did not attack doctrine. A compass did not promote heresy. Yet, these tools allowed discussion about self-control, order, and reason. Philosophy entered quietly through metaphor rather than argument. This made Masonry adaptable. It could exist in monarchies, republics, and mixed religious environments. The lodge structure also reflected Enlightenment habits. Meetings followed rules. Offices were elected. Discussions were guided rather than chaotic. This mirrored new ideas about governance and social order. Members practiced equality within the lodge, even if society outside remained unequal. That contrast was powerful. It did not require rebellion. It required imagination. For church authorities, this was the heart of the problem. Speculative Masonry was not loud or violent. It was calm, organized, and private. It did not shout new doctrines from the street. It quietly trained members to think in symbolic and moral terms outside direct church oversight. In an age already strained by change, that quiet independence was enough to trigger alarm. The Enlightenment did not create Freemasonry, but it shaped the conditions that allowed it to grow from a craft tradition into a society of ideas. In the year 1717, something subtle but lasting happened in London. 4 existing lodges met and agreed to form a central body that would later be known as the Grand Lodge of London. This moment is often treated as a simple administrative step, but its impact was far larger. For the first time, Masonry presented itself as a public institution rather than a loose network of private meetings. The lodge was no longer just a room where members gathered. It became part of an organized system with officers, rules, and a shared identity that could travel beyond local custom. This change did not erase older traditions. It reshaped them. The new Grand Lodge began encouraging regular meetings, recorded minutes, and recognized leadership. Rituals that had varied from place to place slowly moved toward common forms. Words, symbols, and degrees became more consistent, so that a Mason from one lodge could be recognized in another. This standardization made Masonry portable. A member could move from London to another city and still belong. That sense of continuity was new, and it mattered. The public face of Masonry also changed. Lodges were no longer only hidden groups known by rumor. They held public events, processions, and charity work. Printed lists of officers appeared. Constitutions were published, most notably the Constitutions of the Freemasons, compiled by James Anderson in the year 1723. This text presented a history of Masonry rules for conduct, and a vision of the order as moral and orderly. It framed Masonry as compatible with civil society while remaining private in its internal work. This visibility helped Masonry grow quickly. Lodges appeared across England and soon across Europe. Merchants, professionals, and officials joined. The structure created in London served as a model. Yet, this same visibility drew attention from authorities. What had once been a scattered practice rooted in craft now looked like a unified body with influence. Its secrecy no longer appeared accidental. It looked intentional. For the Vatican, this moment marked a shift. An organized institution can be studied, tracked, and judged. Standard rituals mean standard concerns. When reports reached Rome about oaths, private meetings, and mixed membership across religious lines, they described a system, not an accident. The Grand Lodge era made Masonry legible to outsiders in a way it had never been before. The irony is clear. By organizing itself, Masonry made its origins easier to trace. Symbols once tied to local practice became fixed references. Histories once oral became printed. This allowed critics to examine and condemn, but it also preserved evidence. The year 1717 did not create Freemasonry from nothing. It gave it a modern face, one that could expand, attract scrutiny, and leave a paper trail that still shapes how the Vatican and the world understand it today. From that point forward, every discussion about origins, authority, and symbolism would pass through this organized framework, shaping both devotion inside lodges and suspicion outside them for generations to come thereafter. As Masonry moved into the 18th century, rituals became its most defining feature. What had once been informal customs, rooted in craft practice, were shaped into structured ceremonies meant to teach memory, morality, and belonging. This development did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually as lodges sought ways to preserve identity across distance and time. When members no longer shared the same trade, spoken instruction and shared experience became essential. Ritual provided both. Degrees emerged as a practical solution. By dividing membership into stages, lodges created a clear path of learning. Each degree introduced symbols, obligations, and lessons appropriate to a member's progress. This system ensured that knowledge was transmitted in order, not rushed or misunderstood. It also reinforced discipline. Advancement required participation, attention, and trust. In an age with limited literacy, structured ceremony was one of the most effective teaching tools available. The use of drama served memory. Human beings remember experiences more easily than lectures. Ritual placed members inside symbolic actions rather than simply telling them what to believe. Movements, words, and objects worked together to create meaning. This approach was not unique to Masonry. Churches had long used liturgy, procession, and sacred drama to teach doctrine. Medieval guilds also used formal rites to mark apprenticeship and mastery. Freemasonry adapted familiar methods to its own needs. By the early 18th century, 3 primary degrees became common in many lodges. These degrees focused on moral growth, self-knowledge, and responsibility rather than technical skill. The candidate was guided through symbolic trials meant to reflect personal development. Light and darkness, silence and speech, order and chaos were used as teaching contrasts. None of this required belief in hidden powers. It relied on shared cultural language drawn from religion, labor, and education. Ritual also unified lodges spread across regions. When ceremonies followed similar patterns, members could recognize one another, even if they had never met before. This mattered in a rapidly expanding network. A Mason traveling from England to the continent could enter a lodge and feel at home. Standard ritual created trust. It also created concern among authorities, because unity beyond borders suggested independence. Preserving tradition was another key function. Written texts could be lost or altered. Oral ritual reinforced stability through repetition. Each performance linked the present lodge to those before it. Even small variations were noticed and debated, showing how seriously ritual accuracy was taken. This careful preservation helped Masonry maintain continuity while adapting to new social realities. For the Vatican, ritual raised questions. Oaths sworn outside church oversight appeared troubling. Ceremonies that echoed religious forms but avoided explicit doctrine seemed suspicious. Yet, from a historical perspective, Masonic ritual reflects continuity more than rebellion. It borrowed familiar methods to teach ethics in a controlled environment. Degrees and ceremonies were designed to shape character, maintain cohesion, and protect shared values. In doing so, they gave Freemasonry its recognizable form. Ritual became the vessel through which memory traveled, binding generations together in a symbolic language that could survive. The symbols most closely associated with Freemasonry often appear mysterious only when removed from their historical setting. When placed back into the world of medieval and early modern building culture, their meanings become far more direct. The square, compasses, level, plumb line, pillars, aprons, and working tools all came from daily labor. These were objects Masons used with their hands long before they became marks on tracing boards or lodge walls. Their later moral meanings did not replace their practical origins. They grew from them. The square was one of the most important tools on any building site. It ensured that stones met at proper angles and that walls stood true. A poorly squared stone could weaken an entire structure. Because of this, the square became a natural symbol for honesty and fairness. To act squarely meant to act correctly. This connection did not require imagination. It reflected lived experience. Builders knew that precision and integrity were inseparable. The compasses served a different purpose. They set boundaries, measured distance, and created proportion. Without them, plans could not be followed, and designs could not be repeated. In symbolic form, the compasses came to represent self-control and restraint. Just as a builder limits a circle to its proper size, a person was taught to limit excess and keep actions within moral bounds. This lesson echoed Christian teachings already familiar to medieval society. The level and plumb line carried similar weight. The level ensured balance. It reminded builders that structures must be even to stand. The plumb line ensured vertical truth, showing whether a wall rose straight upward. These tools translated easily into moral ideas about equality and upright conduct. Among working masons, they were reminders that no stone was above the laws of gravity. Among speculative members, they became reminders that no person stood above moral law. Pillars entered symbolic language through architecture and scripture. Large buildings relied on pillars for support and order. In the Bible, pillars represented strength and establishment. Churches used them both structurally and symbolically. When Freemasonry adopted pillar imagery, it was drawing from a visual language already embedded in Christian culture. Pillars stood for stability, wisdom, and endurance, not hidden gods or secret powers. The apron is perhaps the most misunderstood symbol. It was simply protective clothing. Stonemasons wore aprons to shield themselves from sharp edges and debris. Over time, the apron became a badge of labor and dignity. In a society that valued noble birth, the apron quietly honored honest work. When accepted masons wore it, the message was clear. Character mattered more than title. Working tools as a group reinforced this lesson. Hammers, chisels, and mallets shaped raw stone into useful form. In moral language, they represented the effort required to shape oneself. Roughness became smoothness through patience and discipline. This metaphor required no secret teaching. It followed directly from observation. When the Vatican examined Masonic symbols, it encountered familiar objects used in unfamiliar settings. The concern was not that these tools were pagan or foreign. It was that they were being used to teach moral lessons outside church authority. Yet, historically, the symbols themselves are simple. They reflect a world where building, belief, and ethics were already connected. The core symbol set of Freemasonry did not arrive from the shadows. It rose from stone dust, shared labor, and a moral language shaped long before the first Grand Lodge ever met. In medieval Europe, geometry was not treated as mystical code or hidden magic. It was a practical language used to understand space, balance, and proportion. Builders relied on geometry because stone does not forgive error. A miscalculated angle could collapse a wall or crack a vault. Geometry was therefore essential knowledge, taught through experience and repetition rather than abstract theory. It explained how to draw a circle, divide space evenly, and align structures so they could endure weight and time. The Church embraced geometry for the same reason. Sacred buildings were meant to reflect order, stability, and harmony. Medieval theologians believed creation itself followed measurable laws set by God. Geometry became proof that the world was not random. It showed that divine reason could be expressed through number and form. When cathedrals were designed, proportions mattered as much as decoration. The goal was not mystery, but coherence. A well-ordered building was seen as an act of praise. This practical respect for geometry carried philosophical meaning. Order suggested truth. Balance suggested justice. Proportions suggested restraint. These ideas were not secret teachings passed in darkness. They were openly discussed in sermons, manuscripts, and schools. Geometry was part of the quadrivium, the advanced subjects of medieval education, alongside arithmetic, music, and astronomy. To study geometry was to study how parts relate to a whole. Masons absorbed this outlook naturally. Their daily work depended on measurement and alignment. Over time, geometry became a symbol of disciplined thought. It reminded builders that skill required patience and reason. When Freemasonry later adopted geometric language, it was continuing this tradition. Geometry represented the idea that a person could shape character the way a builder shapes stone, through steady effort guided by clear rules. Later critics misunderstood this symbolism. They saw diagrams and assumed hidden codes. They heard the phrase sacred geometry and imagined ancient cults. Historically, sacred simply meant dedicated or ordered. Geometry was sacred because it served sacred purposes. It built churches. It organized space for worship. It supported the idea that moral life, like architecture, required structure. Masonic thinkers of the 18th century found geometry appealing because it bridged faith and reason. It did not demand rejection of religion. It allowed discussion of natural law, harmony, and ethics without entering doctrinal disputes. Geometry offered a neutral language understood by Christians of different backgrounds. This made it useful in lodges that valued unity over argument. For the Vatican, geometry itself was not the issue. The Church had relied on it for centuries. The concern arose when geometry was used as a teaching tool outside Church guidance. Even then, historical evidence shows continuity rather than rupture. Sacred geometry without myth means recognizing that numbers and forms were tools of understanding, not keys to forbidden knowledge. They helped builders raise stone and thinkers raise questions within a world that already believed order mattered. In that sense, geometry became a shared bridge between labor belief and reflection rather than a secret map of hidden power for societies alone. Early British Masonry did not emerge as a rival to Christianity. In its formative period, it often existed comfortably within a Christian worldview, shaped by the same assumptions about God, morality, and order that guided wider society. Lodge records, early constitutions, and surviving rituals show that belief in God was expected, not optional. Members were required to acknowledge a supreme being, and in Britain, this almost always meant the Christian God. meetings opened with prayer. Oaths were sworn with religious language. Moral instruction echoed themes familiar from church sermons. This context matters because it challenges a common modern assumption. Many people imagine early Masonry as secretly pagan or anti-Christian from the start. The historical evidence does not support this. In 17th and early 18th century, Britain, openly rejecting Christianity, would have been dangerous and socially isolating. Lodges operated in towns and cities where the church shaped daily life. Their members included clergy, devout laymen, and public officials who remained active in parish life. Masonry did not replace religion for them. It sat alongside it. Early Masonic texts reflect this balance. The constitutions of the Freemasons, published in the year 1723, emphasized moral law and obedience to civil authority. They avoided sectarian disputes, but did not deny Christian belief. Instead, they promoted a form of shared ethics that Christians of different denominations could accept. This approach was practical in a country shaped by religious division. It reduced conflict without denying faith. Symbols and stories within Masonry also drew from Christian culture. Solomon's Temple, biblical figures, and moral lessons grounded in Scripture were familiar references. These were not exotic imports. They were part of the shared language of the time. Even the emphasis on light as a symbol of knowledge mirrored Christian imagery used in sermons and art. Nothing about this required rejection of church teaching. So why did conflict with the Vatican later intensify? The answer lies not in pagan imagery, but in authority. Early British Masonry respected religion, but operated independently of church hierarchy. Moral instruction occurred without clerical supervision. Oaths were taken outside sacramental structures. Lodges created bonds that crossed parish and sometimes denominational lines. For Anglican England, this independence was manageable. For Rome, it raised deeper concerns. The Vatican's objections focused on secrecy, mixed membership, and parallel moral authority. If a group could teach ethics, demand loyalty, and shape conscience without church oversight, it challenged the church's exclusive role. The problem was not that Masons worshipped false gods. It was that they formed moral communities beyond ecclesiastical control. Understanding Christianity inside early Masonry clarifies this tension. The church was not confronting an alien religion. It was confronting a familiar one, reorganized in an unfamiliar way. Masonry took Christian moral language and placed it inside a private structure governed by lay members. That shift mattered more than any symbol. In this light, later Vatican condemnations appear less about imagery and more about jurisdiction. Who had the right to guide souls, shape ethics, and define obedience? Early Masonry shows that the conflict was never simply about pagan symbols. It was about shared ground and who was allowed to stand upon it. As Freemasonry spread from Britain into continental Europe during the 18th century, it began to change in noticeable ways. In France and the German states, lodges did not simply copy the earlier British model, they expanded it. Degrees appeared beyond the original three, often called high degrees, each adding layers of story, symbolism, and ceremony. This was the moment when Masonic imagery grew more elaborate and dramatic, moving far beyond the straightforward moral lessons rooted in building culture. Several forces drove this expansion. Continental Europe had a strong aristocratic culture that valued titles, lineage, and chivalric ideals. When nobles entered lodges, they brought their tastes with them. Medieval knightly orders, crusader legends, and ideas of honor and secret brotherhood appealed strongly to this audience. Degrees began to reference ancient knighthood, lost orders, and noble quests. These stories were not based on documented history. They were romantic inventions shaped by the imagination of the time. The legend of the Knights Templar became especially influential. In the year 1307, the Templars had been suppressed by church and crown, leaving behind mystery and speculation. By the 18th century, writers and lodge leaders began linking Freemasonry to the Templars as symbolic ancestors. This connection offered drama and prestige. It suggested survival through secrecy and persecution. Historically, there is no evidence that medieval Templars founded Masonic lodges. But as symbolic storytelling, the idea was powerful. German-speaking regions added their own layers. Systems like the strict observance claimed direct descent from chivalric orders and demanded obedience to unknown superiors. Titles multiplied. Rituals grew more complex. Alchemical language, mystical references, and philosophical speculation entered certain degrees. This was not universal Masonry. It was one branch among many, but it was loud and influential. These developments created confusion for outsiders. What had begun as a moral fraternity now appeared to be a maze of ranks and secret histories. Even within Masonry, debates erupted. Some members criticized the new degrees as excessive and historically false. Others embraced them as deeper wisdom. There was no single authority controlling all lodges. Diversity increased rapidly. For the Vatican, this explosion of symbolism sharpened concern. Reports reaching Rome from France and German lands described rituals filled with knightly vows, secret hierarchies, and references to persecuted orders. Even if much of this was symbolic theatre, it looked dangerous. It suggested loyalty structures that competed with church authority. It also revived memories of past conflicts between Rome and independent orders. Importantly, these continental degrees did not represent the original core of Masonry. They were additions layered on top of it. The simple tools of the builder were still present, but they were now surrounded by elaborate narratives. This shift explains why later critics often focus on the most dramatic elements while ignoring earlier simplicity. The explosion of new symbolism was a cultural phenomenon, not a hidden, ancient revelation. It reflected 18th century tastes for romance, mystery, and grand stories. Understanding this helps separate documented origins from later invention. It also explains why Vatican attention intensified. What began as moral symbolism rooted in labor had, in some regions, become a theatre of art that blurred the line between history, imagination, and authority. To understand where esoteric ideas actually enter the story, it is necessary to separate documented influence from later legend. Hermetic, Rosicrucian, and alchemical writings did circulate in Europe long before modern Freemasonry took shape. These traditions were part of early modern intellectual culture, especially from the late 15th century through the 17th. Scholars, physicians, theologians, and nobles read and debated them openly, often alongside Christian doctrine. Hermetic texts, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, were rediscovered in Western Europe during the Renaissance. They emphasized divine order, the harmony between heaven and earth, and the idea that understanding nature could lead to moral improvement. Alchemy was similarly misunderstood. While some pursued literal transformation of metals, many treated it as a philosophical language about refinement, patience, and inner change. These ideas circulated through books, universities, and private correspondence. They were not hidden societies. They were part of educated discussion. Rosicrucianism emerged in the early 17th century with the publication of manifestos in German lands. These writings described an imagined brotherhood devoted to wisdom, charity, and reform. Historians agree that the Rosicrucian order described in these texts was largely symbolic. It represented a hope for moral and spiritual renewal rather than a proven organization with lodges and members. Even so, the idea captured imaginations across Europe and sparked debate. Some individuals who later joined Masonic lodges were familiar with these currents. Here, influence becomes possible and limited. In certain continental high-degree systems, in France and Germany, alchemical language and hermetic themes were layered onto existing Masonic structure. These additions were not universal. They appeared in specific systems created by enthusiastic writers and ritual designers, not in early British Masonry overall. It is important to note what did not happen. There is no evidence that Hermetic orders founded Freemasonry or that Rosicrucians secretly controlled lodges. The core symbols of Masonry still came from building culture. The lodge structure still followed craft and guild models. Esoteric language entered as decoration, not foundation. Why did these ideas appeal to some Masons? Because they fit the mood of the age. The Enlightenment encouraged exploration of nature and reason. Alchemical metaphors of refinement matched moral teaching already present in Masonry. Hermetic ideas about order resonated with geometric symbolism. For some, these concepts added depth and drama. For others, they went too far. From the Vatican perspective, this mixture increased concern. Reports describing lodges that discussed alchemy or mystical philosophy blurred boundaries between acceptable study and forbidden speculation. Even if these discussions were symbolic, they looked suspicious when combined with secrecy and oaths. Separating evidence from legend shows a clearer picture. Esoteric currents influenced some fringe Masonic systems. They did not define Masonry as a whole. They entered through individuals and creative ritual systems, not through an ancient hidden pipeline. Recognizing this distinction helps explain both the fascination and the fear surrounding Freemasonry. The mystery was not that forbidden knowledge was unleashed, but that familiar ideas were rearranged in new settings beyond traditional authority. Today, by the middle of the 18th century, the Vatican's attention toward Freemasonry shifted from distant observation to open alarm. This change did not come from rumors alone. It came from reports, correspondence, and growing visibility of lodges across Catholic Europe. What troubled Rome was not a single symbol or story, but a pattern. Men were gathering privately, swearing oaths outside church oversight, forming bonds that crossed social and religious lines, and doing so within an organized structure that answered to no bishop or pope. The first major response arrived in the year 1738, when Pope Clement XII issued the papal bull In Eminenti Apostolatus Specula. This document marked the first sweeping condemnation of Freemasonry by the Catholic Church. Its language was firm and broad. Catholics were forbidden from joining Masonic lodges under penalty of excommunication. The reasons given were revealing. The bull did not accuse Masons of worshipping false gods or practicing pagan rites. Instead, it focused on secrecy, binding oaths, and the danger posed by associations that operated beyond public scrutiny. Secrecy was the central concern. The Church had long viewed secret societies with suspicion, especially in a Europe shaped by rebellion, heresy, and political intrigue. When meetings were closed, discussions hidden, and membership concealed, authorities assumed risk. This fear was intensified by the fact that lodges welcomed men from different backgrounds. Catholics and Protestants could sit together as equals. In a religious landscape defined by boundaries, this mixing appeared dangerous. It suggested loyalty to a group that might outweigh loyalty to church or crown. Oaths raised another alarm. Swearing promises in private, especially without clear knowledge of their content, challenged the Church's authority over conscience. Catholic teaching held that serious oaths should be governed by moral law and clerical guidance. Masonic obligations, taken without priestly oversight, appeared to place moral authority elsewhere. Even if the oaths were ethical in intent, the structure itself was unacceptable to Rome. Political fear also played a role. Lodges spread quickly through cities and courts. Members included merchants, officers, and officials. In an age of fragile states, any private network looked like a potential threat. The Vatican did not need proof of rebellion. The possibility alone was enough. History had taught Rome that ideas could destabilize kingdoms faster than armies. Importantly, this condemnation applied broadly. The bull did not distinguish between different types of lodges or degrees. It treated Freemasonry as a single phenomenon. This lack of nuance reflected the Church's defensive position. When faced with uncertainty, it chose prohibition over investigation. The Vatican's first major alarm was therefore institutional, not mystical. It was about control, authority, and order. Freemasonry represented a new kind of association, moral in language, private in practice, and international in reach. That combination had no clear place within Catholic governance. This moment set the tone for everything that followed. Later condemnations would repeat and expand these concerns, but the core fear was already clear. Freemasonry was not condemned because it was ancient or occult. It was condemned because it organized conscience, loyalty, and identity outside the structures the Church had long controlled. After the first condemnation in the year 1738, the Vatican did not step back. It began to watch more closely. Over the following decades, Freemasonry remained on Rome's radar, not as a passing concern, but as a recurring problem that refused to disappear. Each new report, each local dispute, and each question sent by bishops added to what became a growing administrative record. Bulls, briefs, letters, and internal notes accumulated, forming a dossier that expanded with time. In the year 1751, Pope Benedict XIV issued the bull Providus Romanorum Pontificum. This document did not introduce new accusations. Instead, it reaffirmed the earlier ban and explained why it remained necessary. The repetition itself is significant. The Vatican felt the need to restate its position because lodges continued to spread, and Catholics continued to join them despite the risk of punishment. Persistence forced the Church to clarify and defend its stance in greater detail. Each condemnation triggered communication across Europe. Bishops wrote to Rome asking how strictly the rules should be enforced. Confessors sought guidance on whether Masons could receive absolution. Civil authorities sometimes shared information when lodges were investigated or shut down. All of this material flowed inward. The Vatican was not relying on rumor alone. It was collecting descriptions of meetings, summaries of rituals as reported by former members, and observations about lodge organization. This process repeated across generations. In the year 1786, Pope Pius VI renewed condemnation in Humanum Genus language, later echoed by his successors. In the year 1821, and again in the year 1825, Pope Pius VII and Pope Leo XII issued further documents reinforcing the ban. Each text reflected not only doctrine, but accumulated experience. By this point, the Church had decades of reports describing how lodges operated in different countries. What emerged was not a single clear picture, but a layered one. The Vatican learned that Masonry was not uniform. Some lodges focused on charity and moral discussion. Others embraced elaborate rituals and high degrees. Some stayed politically quiet. Others became entangled in liberal or nationalist movements. This variety did not soften Rome's position, it hardened it. Unpredictability itself was a threat. The growing dossier explains why Vatican officials often spoke with confidence about Masonic practices. They had read exposure pamphlets. They had questioned converts and defectors. They had reviewed police reports and episcopal warnings. Even when information was imperfect or biased, the volume was large. Over time, patterns appeared. Secrecy, oaths, internal loyalty, and independence from church authority remained constant themes. This long paper trail matters for understanding later claims. When people say the Vatican knows the real origins of Freemason rituals and symbols, part of that knowledge comes from administration, not revelation. Rome studied what it opposed. Condemnation required justification, and justification required information. The result was a paradox. By repeatedly condemning Freemasonry, the Vatican also preserved detailed records about it. These documents allowed church authorities to track changes, compare systems, and respond with precision. Bulls and briefs were not just warnings. They were milestones in a growing archive that made the Vatican one of the most informed observers of the very organization it sought to suppress. In 18th and early 19th century Europe, the Vatican did not operate in isolation. It existed within a dense web of Catholic monarchies, local bishops, inquisitorial offices, and civil authorities who all shared an interest in monitoring private associations. Freemasonry, because of its secrecy and international reach, attracted attention from this entire system. As a result, Rome received a steady flow of second-hand intelligence gathered far from the Vatican walls. Catholic monarchies were often the first collectors of information. In countries like Spain, Portugal, the Italian states, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, rulers viewed secret societies with suspicion regardless of religion. Police officials tracked meetings, questioned suspected members, and seized papers when lodges were discovered. These investigations were not always driven by theology. They were driven by fear of unrest, rebellion, or foreign influence. Still, the results frequently ended up in ecclesiastical hands. Local bishops played a key role. When papal condemnations were issued, bishops were responsible for enforcement. To do that, they needed information. They questioned parishioners, monitored rumors, and reported findings back to Rome. Confessors were instructed to ask direct questions about lodge membership. When Masons sought absolution, their statements sometimes became informal intelligence reports. This was not espionage in a modern sense. It was pastoral oversight blending into surveillance. Inquisitorial structures also contributed, especially in regions where they still operated with authority. Although the image of the Inquisition is often exaggerated, it remained an administrative tool for investigating suspected heresy and forbidden associations. Freemasonry fell into this category after papal bans, depositions, witness statements, and seized ritual exposures were compiled and forwarded through church channels. Over time, these documents built familiarity with lodge claims and practices. Informants added another layer. Disgruntled members, expelled brethren, or individuals seeking favor with authorities sometimes described lodge rituals in detail. Many of the so-called exposures published in the 18th century came from such sources. While their accuracy varied, they provided Rome with names, symbols, passwords, and degree structures. The Vatican did not need to invent knowledge. It received it filtered through fear, loyalty, and personal motive. This flow of information shaped perception. Reports often emphasize the most dramatic elements. High degrees, chivalric titles, and elaborate ceremonies stood out more than charitable work or quiet discussion. When such descriptions reached Rome, they reinforced concern. A picture formed of an organization that was hidden, oath-bound, and difficult to regulate. Whether that picture was complete mattered less than the fact that it was consistent across regions. Confessional Europe functioned as an information network. Church and state overlapped. A police raid could become a pastoral report. A confession could become a warning. Each piece alone might be flawed, but together they created volume. By the time later popes addressed Freemasonry, they were not reacting blindly. They were responding to decades of accumulated reports. This context explains why the Vatican appeared unusually well informed about Masonic organization and ritual claims. That knowledge did not come from secret infiltration at the top. It came from the ground up. From monarchies anxious about order, bishops enforcing doctrine, inquisitors following procedure, and informants speaking out. In a Europe built on confession and control, information flowed steadily toward Rome, shaping policy long before the modern age of intelligence ever began. By the late 18th century, Freemasonry and the Vatican were describing the same institution in very different ways. Masons spoke of themselves as members of a moral fraternity. They emphasized charity, personal improvement, and the use of symbols to teach ethical lessons. Official statements, lodge constitutions, and public defenses insisted that Masonry was not a religion, not a political party, and not a threat to the state. From their perspective, it was a voluntary society designed to make good men better. Rome heard something else entirely. Vatican officials did not focus on intentions. They focused on structure. They saw an organization that initiated members through private rituals, bound them with oaths, and required loyalty that was not supervised by church authority. To the Vatican, this looked like a parallel moral system. Even if Masons claimed neutrality, the form itself raised alarm. Authority was being exercised without ecclesiastical permission. Masons often argued that symbolism prevented dogma. By avoiding detailed theology, they believed they were creating harmony among men of different beliefs. This was presented as tolerance. Rome interpreted it as relativism. If truth was reduced to shared moral feeling rather than revealed doctrine, then objective teaching appeared weakened. The Church had spent centuries defining truth precisely to avoid confusion. A system that allowed many interpretations seemed dangerous by design. Charity became another point of misunderstanding. Lodges proudly pointed to hospitals, relief funds, and aid for widows and orphans. These works were real and documented. The Vatican did not deny them, but it asked a different question. Who directed that charity, and to what end? Independent charitable networks meant influence. Influence meant power. When charity flowed through lodges instead of parishes, it shifted loyalty away from established channels. Politics added further tension. Many Masons insisted that lodges avoided political debate. In some places, this was true. In others, members carried lodge friendships into revolutionary movements, liberal reforms, or nationalist causes. Rome did not separate the lodge room from the public square. It judged by outcomes. When Masons appeared among leaders of uprisings or anti-clerical laws, suspicion hardened. Even if Masonry did not order rebellion, it seemed to create networks that enabled it. The two sides also spoke against each other because of different views of secrecy. Masons defended secrecy as a way to preserve tradition and equality. Ritual created shared experience. Rome saw secrecy as concealment. In a system built on confession and transparency before God, hidden obligations were unacceptable. No explanation could bridge that gap. Language itself failed. When Masons said fraternity, they meant brotherhood. When Rome heard fraternity, it heard rival allegiance. When Masons said light, they meant knowledge. When Rome heard light, it heard unauthorized teaching. Both sides used familiar words, but attached different meanings. This divide explains the endurance of conflict. Neither side was fully wrong, and neither fully understood the other. Masons underestimated how threatening their structure appeared to an institution built on centralized authority. The Vatican underestimated how sincerely many Masons viewed their work as moral and civic, not religious rebellion. A tale of two realities emerged, one defined from inside the lodge as ethical symbolism and mutual aid, the other defined from Rome as parallel authority and potential subversion. Because each side spoke from its own framework, dialogue failed, condemnations continued, defenses hardened, and the gap between intention and perception became one of the most lasting features of the Vatican and Freemasonry conflict. The 19th century transformed the disagreement between the Vatican and Freemasonry into something larger and more intense. What had once been a dispute over secrecy and authority became part of a wider cultural struggle reshaping Europe. Revolutions, nationalist movements, and liberal politics swept across the continent, challenging old alliances between throne and altar. In this turbulent setting, Freemasonry was no longer seen only as a private fraternity. It became linked, fairly or not, to forces the Church viewed as existential threats. Across Europe, calls for constitutional government, freedom of conscience, and national self-determination gained momentum. Many leaders of these movements were educated men who had passed through lodges. This did not mean Masonry directed revolutions, but it did mean Masons often stood at the crossroads of new ideas. Lodge networks helped spread Enlightenment values like civil equality and secular law. To supporters, these were steps toward progress. To the Vatican, they looked like systematic erosion of church influence. Italy became a central battlefield. The movement to unify the Italian peninsula challenged the Papal States directly. As nationalist forces advanced, the Pope lost territory and political power. Several figures associated with unification were openly hostile to clerical authority, and some were also Masons. This association deeply marked Vatican memory. Masonry appeared not just independent, but actively opposed to the Church's temporal role. France offered another example. After the Revolution of 1789, anti-clerical laws restricted religious orders and church property. In the decades that followed, republics rose and fell, often promoting secular education and limiting ecclesiastical privilege. Some of the strongest advocates of these reforms were linked to lodges. Even when policies were driven by broader political philosophy, the presence of Masons reinforced suspicion. The Vatican responded defensively. Papal documents of the century spoke with increasing urgency. Masonry was portrayed as a force behind materialism, moral relativism, and attacks on Christian society. The language sharpened, because the stakes had changed. This was no longer about private meetings. It was about the survival of a world view. From the Masonic side, many members saw themselves as champions of modern society. They argued that separating church and state protected freedom of belief. They framed anti-clericalism not as hatred of faith, but as resistance to institutional dominance. Yet, this distinction meant little in Rome. When laws closed monasteries or removed religion from schools, intent mattered less than outcome. The 19th century thus hardened positions on both sides. The Vatican came to see Masonry as part of a coordinated cultural campaign against tradition. Masons increasingly viewed the Church as resistant to necessary reform. Each confirmed the fears of the other. This period explains why Vatican condemnations grew more severe and sweeping. They were shaped not only by theology, but by history, lived under pressure. Revolutions had shown how quickly power could vanish. Networks of influence had proven effective. In that context, any organization operating beyond church control appeared dangerous. The culture war of the 19th century left a deep mark. It fused political struggle with religious conflict, and placed Freemasonry at the center of that fusion in the Vatican's mind. Even when later eras softened rhetoric, the memory of this century remained. It taught Rome that symbols and rituals could not be separated from politics when the world itself was being remade. By the late 19th century, Vatican opposition to Freemasonry reached its most organized and systematic form under Pope Leo XIII. Unlike earlier condemnations that reacted to specific concerns or regional threats, Leo approached the issue as a unified ideological conflict. He treated Freemasonry not as a scattered collection of lodges, but as a coherent worldview standing in opposition to Christian society. This shift marked a turning point in how the Church framed the issue. In the year 1884, Leo XIII issued the encyclical Humanum Genus. This document did not simply repeat earlier bans. It gathered decades of suspicion, reports, and political experience into a single framework. Freemasonry was described as promoting a naturalistic philosophy that rejected divine revelation and replaced it with human reason alone. According to Leo, this worldview undermined religion, morality, and social order at the same time. What made this encyclical different was its structure. Leo divided the world into two opposing camps. On one side stood the Church and Christian civilization. On the other stood forces he believed sought to dismantle it. Freemasonry was placed firmly in the second category. The argument was no longer about secrecy alone. It was about ideas. Masonry was portrayed as a system that encouraged secular education, civil marriage, freedom of conscience detached from doctrine, and separation of church and state. These goals were not imagined. They reflected real political movements of the century. Leo's writing shows careful synthesis. He drew on earlier bulls, political developments, and philosophical trends. He linked Masonry to liberalism, socialism, and anti-clerical legislation, even when those movements were not formally Masonic. The connection was ideological rather than organizational. To Leo, the shared rejection of church authority was enough to unite them. This approach clarified the Vatican position for future generations. Masonry was no longer just forbidden. It was defined as incompatible with Catholic belief at a foundational level. Joining a lodge was framed as choosing an opposing moral vision. This removed ambiguity. Catholics were not warned merely of danger. They were told the two systems could not coexist. From the Masonic perspective, this was a misunderstanding. Many lodges continued to see themselves as ethical societies, not philosophical enemies of Christianity. They argued that natural law and moral virtue did not negate faith. But Leo's concern was not individual belief, it was influence. Ideas shape laws, schools, and culture. By the late 19th century, the Church had seen enough change to conclude that Masonry's influence pointed consistently in one direction. The encyclical also reflected loss. The Papal States were gone. The Church no longer wielded temporal power. In this weakened position, clarity became a form of defense. Systematizing the argument was a way to draw firm boundaries in a changing world. Leo XIII did not invent Vatican opposition to Freemasonry. He organized it. He turned scattered fears into a coherent doctrine. This framework would guide Catholic teaching well into the 20th century. It explained why the Vatican believed it understood Masonry so well. It had studied it for generations and now believed it had identified its core. Whether that conclusion was fully accurate remains debated. But what is clear is this. Under Leo, the conflict stopped being episodic. It became ideological. Freemasonry was no longer just watched. It was defined as a rival vision of society itself. When claims arise that the Vatican knows the real origins of Freemason rituals and symbols, it is important to narrow the scope of what can actually be known with certainty. History operates through documents, correspondence, decrees, and reports. On that level, the Church does possess a detailed record of how Masonry developed, how its practices changed, and how those practices were perceived over time. The Vatican can say with confidence that Freemasonry did not appear fully formed in antiquity. Its earliest verifiable roots lie in medieval craft culture and early modern social organization.